Welcome to the last session of this conference on employment services in the future, generously supported by Jobs Australia, LISA and WCIG. My name, for those of you who either weren't here this morning or can't remember, because this morning was such a long time ago, is Helen Sullivan, and I'm Professor and Centre Director of the Centre for Public Policy that's hosted this event. And I have to say, just from the words that I've been hearing in the breaks and the conversations that people have been having, this seems to have been an incredibly lively event where what we wanted to achieve, which was to bring together academics and practitioners and to generate some real discussion, seems to have done just that. So if that's how you feel, that's terrific. If it's not how you feel, then let us know and we'll see what we can do in the future. Before we go on into this final session, the keynote address, there are a couple of people who have worked incredibly hard to put this together. I mentioned them this morning. They don't know this. They're going to be horribly embarrassed. But we thought that they have worked so hard that we and you should acknowledge them. The first person is Sue Olney, who did all of the abstracts, all of the organisation. Sue, would you come up? No, up you come. And the second person, who you will all have met at least once, if you haven't already met her on email, is Georgie Cahill, who does an extraordinary job of organising me and everything else. And for once in her life has listened to me when I've said, you must sit down and stay there until I've finished talking. So Georgie, thank you so much. Okay, so and on to tonight's business, which is the keynote address by Greg Ashmead. This session will be chaired by Sally Sinclair. It will feature Greg and with a response from Mark. And I'm going to let Sally do those introductions. But it's my very pleasurable task to introduce Sally, the CEO of the National Employment Services Association, a long-time supporter of the University of Melbourne's research programme on employment services, both personally in terms of her ongoing advice, but also through the work that her organisation does in supporting the research. Sally, as you know, has got extensive experience in designing, developing and delivering employment and related services, and has been instrumental in informing policy developments not just here in Australia, but also sits on advisory groups internationally. So she is extremely well equipped to chair what I've no doubt will be a really engaging and exciting session. And with that, I'll hand over to Sally.
I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I thought I'd play that. You've each got a copy of it in your pack or your satchel, but that's why we're all here. That's why we do what we do. That's really the reason for the people who work, like Greg, across the globe, like people who work at the front line, who essentially know what it is to actually provide someone with the opportunity for work and an opportunity to change their life. And particularly once people have found themselves out of work for some time, we know that the longer they've been out of work, the more challenging that is to actually provide that opportunity to get them back into work. And that's where employment services have such a critical role. We've had a great day, and indeed I was privileged to also participate yesterday in a research roundtable where we've heard about a whole range of initiatives that are happening globally. And I think that certainly in Australia, we know we feel, and interestingly, some of the work of the OECD has validated that we're at the forefront of some of the great innovations that have happened in employment services over the last 15 years of contracting out of employment services in Australia. But I think that for us, it's going to be a great opportunity to obviously hear what that looks like on the global level, where you take that expertise and you look at how many people you can actually assist on a worldwide basis. I'd like to say thanks to Helen for introducing me, and also to Georgie and to Sue, who've been a great support. My particular thanks, obviously, to Siobhan O'Sullivan and to long-time mate, Mark Considine, for staging what I think has been a terrific program today, and a real opportunity, as I said, to learn from one another, to learn what's happening not just domestically but also internationally, and always, as when we come together, the opportunity to network with our peers and our colleagues and to learn and exchange and trade ideas. And so it's always a fantastic experience. Of course, there's some of you have joined us tonight who've not been part of that process, and I welcome you to the public lecture. Just before I introduce Greg, I might just reflect a little bit of a personal journey, because we're here in 111 Barry Street, and my original student house that I lived in was at 155 Barry Street, and I actually just went up to check on it to see that, because I had the downstairs front bedroom. And that was when I was doing my Bachelor of Science at Melbourne University, and I did an honours degree majoring in neuropsychology. And it felt sort of quite nostalgic, actually, being here for the last 2 days, and a bit of a journey, because I thought, well, here I was, starting to be a neuropsychologist, and here I am, a career really in human resources more broadly, but the last 20 years has actually been in this interesting and radical social and public policy experiment of contracting out of employment services. And Mark and I first met when case management was being explored, and the contracting of case management, and that was some 20 years ago. It's scary. So it's been an interesting road for someone who actually would otherwise have been working as a neuropsychologist, originally at the Multiple Sclerosis Society. So there you go. And I think as an industry, we're full of people who've come to this work through all sorts of different pathways and different journeys. But collectively, we're committed to improving people's lives and to doing that through assisting them to participate more fully in society. So on that note, I would like to introduce Greg, because certainly he has done an outstanding job in delivering on that objective over the last, I'll say 25, but I suspect it's a few more years than that, Greg. And he's got a wealth of national and international experience. Greg's the Managing Director of Global Operations for NGS, and he's also Executive Director of the NGS Board. He's an expert commentator on understanding and responding to workforce participation challenges, both domestically and globally. And tonight he's going to talk to us about the future trajectories for employment services, opportunities and challenges for service providers. Greg's had more than 25 years of experience, as I said. you can tell me how many, in both private and public employment service provision. And he's got vast experience in steering the Ingeus Group in particular through the constant and extensive growth, particularly within European labour markets. He's well positioned to speak on the global employment challenges, common workforce participation problems, the challenges and opportunities with public and private partnerships, policy experiences, line quality performance, procuring and measuring employment services, and also looking at the competitive performance of employment services. And Greg's certainly actively engaged, and we tend to occasionally cross paths in various fora in the international employment services policy space. And I'm certainly sure he's going to be able to offer us a valuable insight on this sort of interesting globalisation of contractual arrangements in employment services, or welfare to work provision, or as they call it in the States, workforce solutions. So it really depends upon what countries you're in. And also now we've got obviously the emerging economies in Asia and also in Latin America. That this is really a very dynamic industry, and certainly Ingeus and Greg in his key leadership role have been at the forefront of that. So would you please join me in welcoming Greg?
Thanks very much, Sally, for that introduction. I have to put the reading glasses on because I have actually been around for longer than 25 years in this industry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Centre for Public Policy for inviting me to speak at this conference today. It's really an honour for a little Aussie company from the back blocks of Brisbane to get an opportunity to address a forum like this. So I really do appreciate it. The conference actually is very timely. There's governments the whole world over grappling with this whole concept of better models for delivering services to unemployed people, particularly people most in need. And we heard Mark Considine talking this morning about the formation of employment services policy is at the cutting edge of public service delivery and shaping public service delivery. And there's a recent example of that, a current example in the work program, where the procurement framework that's been put in place for the delivery of employment service is actually the procurement framework that's also going to be used for other services, potentially in the justice area and various other areas. So they certainly employment services is at the forefront of all of that. Ingeus has been fortunate to have had the opportunity to interact with governments in a number of different parts of the world. With mature governments as far as the outsourcing process is concerned, but also developing governments and developing markets. But there are a few guiding principles, some of which are pretty obvious, I think, that has helped us along our journey. One is that one size doesn't fit all. Not a surprise, really. It doesn't fit all in terms of labour markets, and it certainly doesn't fit all in terms of individual clients. Everybody and every labour market requires a tailored response, a flexible, respectful, tailored response that's co-designed with the individuals that are participating. Secondly, genuine partnerships work. I've seen markets where we talk about partnerships, but it's not the level of collaboration that you would hope for. There's actually a degree of competitiveness and combativeness sometimes that actually doesn't help the services that we deliver. I also think a critical area is knowledge sharing. We spend a lot of time in our company making sure that we take advantage of the fact that we are working in a lot of different markets and tackling similar problems, but having to tailor those in a different way. And so we spend a lot of time sharing information within our business, but we also spend a lot of time sharing information in markets that we're in with partners. And examples of that are For example, in Germany, when we set up in Germany, we actually brought over a number of the public employment service staff to the UK, trained them in our methodology so that they knew exactly where we were coming from. And we've done the same in different markets around the place. In Korea, we actually involve people, not-for-profit partners, and they are partners, they're not subcontractors, not-for-profit partners, to come into training programs with our people so that they get the benefit of that as well. I think another not so surprising area is that work matters to people all over the world. It matters to people whether you're in France or Germany or Korea or Sweden or Switzerland. People want to know that that tomorrow can be better than today, and that work is an option for them. Employment markets also need to be better connected with the health sector and obviously the skills sector. The skills sector is a little more obvious, but the health sector is one that we get continually frustrated with because we've got the health sector doing clinical assessments of people's capability to work that aren't necessarily based on functional capacity and work capacity. And what worries me about that is sometimes people get shuffled off into long-term benefit situations which they don't get better in. In fact, we know people get well at work, and if you get shuffled off like that, you can feel like that's the end of the road. And I think the other thing that we've learnt is employment services programs don't create jobs generally. We can facilitate job brokerage, we can do all manner of things for preparing people for the job market, but generally speaking, jobs aren't created in employment services programs. What's required is leadership at all levels of government and community to ensure that jobs are created at the local level. And I guess one of the saddest things that I've seen lately, fairly recently, is going into old coal mining towns in the UK that have fourth generation unemployment, and they just haven't reinvented themselves. They haven't got into any form of community regeneration, and we're doing a lot of work in the social enterprise space now, talking to organisations to see if we can generate some of that. But they need local champions, they need local leaders to make sure that communities can see hope in the future. Today, most advanced economies can boast some kind of public-private labour intermediary service. Jobs can now be sent and received with the push of a button. We have a clearer understanding of what works and what doesn't work in relation to delivering services to unemployed people. And we know how all that functions, but it's such a volatile environment, and trying to keep ahead of the game is something that occupies our minds all the time. If employment services are going to rise to the challenges of the 21st century, they are going to have to reshape and readapt and on a regular basis, because change is exponential in this area. I'll share for you in this presentation some of the observations that we have had of where we think, I guess, the trends are moving. Just some comments about Ingeus and who we are. And it's not an advertisement, it's just so you've got some context. We were founded by Therese Rain in 1989. It was a VOC rehab service for injured workers that couldn't return to their pre-injury occupation. And I guess those sort of services morphed into case management, and we were work directions, as it was known at the time, was involved in those early days of contracted case management, and it evolved from there. But as a result of the methodologies that we learned in those early days, we now work with a whole range of different client groups. They include long-term unemployed, young people, mature age people, people with disabilities, people on health-related benefits, refugees. We had a program in Sweden that was designed to integrate refugees into work from North Africa and Iraq. We work with executives in outplacement, and that particularly in Korea and France. We work with veterans who are looking to transition into civilian life with the Department of Defence in Korea. We generally contract with governments in the welfare to work market, but we also contract with corporates to deliver outplacement services as well as employee assistance programs and business psychology services. An example of working with corporates is in Korea, for example, we have an Ingeus Samsung co-branded office where we do all of the outplacement for executives from Samsung. We also run retirement programs from those offices where we assist retiring Samsung executives into either new jobs or self-employment and so on. That program's called Silver Flourishing, which is great. Just a bit about our history. As I said, we started in Australia in '89. I remember having a strategic planning meeting in 2001 and realising that 75% of our business was with the federal government in Australia, and we thought we'd better diversify both in terms of product and diversify geographically. Kind of didn't realise we were going to geographically diversify by quite so much at that stage, but we decided to do that. And in Australia, we had a recruitment company, a training company, a vocational rehabilitation company, and a job network company. We, as I said, did decide to diversify geographically, and we thought the UK would be a good place to start. We mistakenly thought we had the same similar culture, so we thought that would work pretty well. But with all the markets you're in, they're all different. But the UK's been great for us. We started in the UK in November 2002 with a small contract in 2 sites in Westminster and Hammersmith. We have delivered several different programs since then, and we're now the largest provider of welfare to work services in the United Kingdom. We started in France in 2005, in Germany in 2006, in Sweden in 2008, in Switzerland in 2009, in Korea in 2009, in Poland in 2010, in Saudi Arabia in 2011, and we re-entered Australia in 2011 in a different market, delivering employee assistance programs and organisational development services. We're also delivering those in New Zealand and funnily enough, in Papua New Guinea as well. So that's the kind of journey that we've been on. So just to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges that are shaping our future. It's perhaps worth spending a few moments to reflect on what we mean by globalisation. You can open any newspaper these days and read about globalisation, but some of the issues that are confronting us are emerging economies growing on the international stage at an incredible rate. And there was a report by Boston Consulting that identifies 100 firms from emerging economies that are beginning to eclipse the traditional markets of Europe and the US. As you might expect, they are primarily China and India, but other countries also, in terms of Indonesia, Chile, are creating what Boston Group describe as a seismic shift, with them generating those firms, those 100 firms, generating 1.4 million jobs, while employment among the S&P 500 firms has been pretty static. So we're seeing quite a, obviously, change in the landscape of the sort of companies that are generating work. And even as unemployment remains high in many countries, there's big global opportunities for business in 2013. And Deloitte are warning now that the talent pool is going to be a real challenging problem for businesses in the future. And we're seeing that already. I know that in the outplacement business that we work in, it's evident everywhere. In 2012, Asia accounted for 17% of highly skilled migrants moving to developed economies. As the Asian economy grows, will that shift of talent continue, or will it be soaked up in Asia? And that's a key issue. And meanwhile, in the Eurozone, we've hit 11.7% average unemployed. In Spain, adult unemployment is at 26%, and for young people, it's an eye-watering 55% unemployment. Obviously, the impact of the ageing population or workforce is widely known, but we're also experiencing directly the growing populations of many emerging countries. And almost 2 years ago, after the Arab Spring, youth unemployment still remains one of the biggest problems in the Middle East and Asia. 46% labour force participation against a global average of 66%. So the real challenge here is the skills mismatch, and we're seeing that in Saudi Arabia at the moment. There's young people have and by the way, 70% of Saudi Arabia population is under 30. We're seeing a lot of those people with fairly unrealistic views of what jobs they'd like to do. And we spend a lot of our time just trying to work through that with people. So many countries ageing rapidly. The migration challenge is becoming even greater. Over the past decade, new immigrants have accounted for about 70% of the increase in the labour force in Europe. And unfortunately, that group isn't being managed very well. And there's still a mismatch, if you like, between the employment of new migrants and the native population. Not only is it a waste of valuable talent, but it has some, I think, long-term risks in terms of marginalisation. So some trends affecting the PES. Predicting the future of the world of work has become a bit of an industry in its own right, and I think there's probably been a few discussions about that today. Who knows what it's going to be like. The reality is that 50% of jobs haven't even been invented yet, so things are going to change and change quite quickly. We've had quite a lot of work being done in Europe, certainly through the European Public Employment Service Network, to look at what the future holds. And there was a paper called PES 2020, which sets out what they see as the future challenges facing employment services in the future. And also the head of the German Public Employment Service, the Bundesagentur, wrote a paper called BA 2020, Promoting Employment in a Changing World. And there were 6 major trends which were identified. Firstly, in the box on the left, paradigm shift in workplaces that we have witnessed over the past 20 years has been astonishing. I think the phrase "a job for life" has basically disappeared, and surprisingly quickly people have accepted that. Jobs have increasingly shifted from a job title on a business card to solutions-oriented resource. Developments like outsourcing and just-in-time supply chains have helped many people away from the 9-to-5 existence and increasingly work is project-based, and employers are allowing working from home practices. Part-time workers and consultants are forming a large chunk of new jobs that are being created. So that process, that work is changing quite quickly. The labour market is facing greater volatility as well. If you look at the statistics now, people are changing jobs about 8 times in their career and 4 times before they're 30. And the average job tenure is only just a little over 3 years. So managing these sorts of trends is no easy feat for employment services. How do we encourage job seekers to take more control of their careers? How do we get them to see themselves as a company for hire and not as an employee, as somebody that can actually take a leading role in their future? And if low-skilled jobs are disappearing and job security is a thing of the past, then how do we ensure disadvantaged job seekers can move smoothly between jobs or careers? And how can we improve their chances to sustain and progress in work? And job outcome payments are increasingly based on sustainability. So in terms of private provision, we're going to have to, as a group, get a lot better at making sure that people are well prepared for work, and that the jobs that they're going into are sustainable jobs. Even some countries that have met with some success in recent times, like Germany, have an increasing number of very long-term unemployed people. There's a real solid block of long-term unemployed people. And I heard the comment at one stage today where people are talking about systems have been so successful that anybody that can't get a job now has probably got more and more challenges than client groups in the past, and that's something that we're all contending with. I think also job seekers need to be more social media savvy, IT savvy generally. They don't need briefcases, they need a smartphone these days, and they need to have a digital presence and need to be able to promote themselves online. It's a very important part of the way the labour markets are moving at the moment. I've already mentioned how an ageing population is changing the broader labour market landscape, but the figures are a bit sobering. Germany alone will lose 3.5 million workers by 2020, and that kind of movement of population is occurring in a number of major economies. Employers in Germany are already taking some measures to address that, and interestingly, BMW have a program for their grey talent, as they describe it, to re-equip their workshops, etc., to make them more seniors friendly. Obviously, they've got big red buttons and green buttons and stuff like that, which is great. But shrinking workforces are probably the biggest driver pushing governments to expand the reach and personalisation of activation measures. As retirement rates rise to 67 and beyond, a number of countries' employment services will need to work hard to find solutions for seniors, and we've got to change some mindsets to be able to do that, because it's not obviously an easy process. The internationalisation of labour markets is another facet of the need for economies to reach out for new pools of labour. Technology and social recruiting systems will empower those at the front of the queue to share information, manage their careers and become more interlinked than ever before. But what about the people that are doing cleaning and caring? How do we make sure that we offer greater opportunities and better integration for those people? And I think that this is going to be an increasing problem for us. Of course, the huge issue that we're seeing face to face at the moment is still the impact of the global financial crisis. A lot of governments have no choice but to look at significant restructuring of their public employment services, and crucially getting value for the taxpayer's dollar. Interestingly, in Europe, externalising employment services in some countries is not seen as really an acceptable thing to do. They've been very much steeped in the history of delivering these kinds of services through the public sector, and it is changing though, because I think there's a realisation that they need to build in the flexibilities to be able to deal with volatile labour markets, and more obviously are getting involved in that. We're involved, I guess, at a bilateral level with several countries on that kind of issue. I just want to make a few points about some of the critical success factors that we see in this environment. It's absolutely essential that we make services more personalised, and I talked about that before. What I think one of the concerns we have is that people get run through the mill and get quite disengaged with some of the programs that are delivered. We've got to be creative. We've got to engage with our clients and make sure that they see value in getting involved. We've got to increase accessibility to services, and I think accessibility is a major issue for the future, not only physically, but also developing of e-services. And one of the things that we're finding, we're working more and more with people on health-related benefits, and we've got to make sure that, particularly people with mobility issues and so on, we can take the service to them. And we're doing that more and more, and we're doing that through the development of client portals, but also just the basic IT system that's web-based that allows us that kind of mobility. Increasing sustainability is obviously a major issue, and you'll see when I describe the work program, which is our biggest market, how important that is. But it's important, obviously, for our clients to make sure that they get into decent, lasting jobs. We've got to link skills more closely to the world of work, and a lot of the things that we're doing these days are working with industry to make sure that the right kind of programs are being developed, and that's not new to any of you, I'm sure. Engaging more effectively with employers. We have a very strong employer strategy in all of our businesses. I think it's more and more important where countries are in recession to develop those relationships with employers at a peak level. So we have lots of contracts, for example, in the UK at a national level with the Sainsbury's and the Tesco's of the world and so on, but also with SMEs, because that's where obviously a lot of the jobs come from. We've got to improve performance and make it efficient delivery. Governments are really looking for efficiencies. They're looking for quality services, but they don't want to pay a huge amount of money for those. And we're looking to improve the evidence base by harnessing information, and we have developed data analytics, which I'll talk a little bit about a bit later. We need to increase participation rates, and this does require a more personalised employment service. And profiling is a key aspect of that, and you know, sometimes it's a dirty word and it's not run very well. But we've got to make sure that people get the right level of service at the right time. It's absolutely critical. We've heard a lot about parking and creaming and so on today, and that's certainly not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when a person presents as ready for a job, let's not put a brake on the Porsche. Let's make sure that they get an opportunity. But let's not force people into work when they're not ready for it. And I guess the way I describe it is work focused, not work first. Make sure that the activities that we get engaged in with people is focused on work, is real, and is likely to produce outcomes for them. We also operate in a diverse supply chain stakeholder environment, again, particularly in the UK. And that's about making sure that we use all of the resources of labour markets to deliver great services. Compatible systems and reporting with best practice shared across the supply chain. We actually have 150 subcontractors in the UK, and all of those subcontractors have access to our IT system, and it has enhanced their delivery processes. E-services and social media I've talked about. Face-to-face services are still important. I think we've got to be really clear that there are groups of people that absolutely require face-to-face, and we should always do that. But one of the things I was talking earlier to a couple of people about was with our client portal, it gives us the opportunity for our clients to access information and provide information to their advisor in a secure site, so that when they are face-to-face, it actually maximises the quality of that time. And clients given the opportunity to take more ownership in the design of programs. The reality is that the most effective programs that we've had have been designed by the clients themselves. And we've done a few programs, for example, for lone parents that where they designed the program and the outcomes were substantially better. I want to talk a little bit about the prime contractor model in the United Kingdom. Just to give you a bit of context, we're in a joint venture with Deloitte in the United Kingdom. We pretty much had to because it was such a big investment. We now have 23% of the national market in the United Kingdom. The next to us in terms of competitors has 13%. But the model is built around Job Centre Plus being the gateway to the service. And Job Centre Plus spend the first 12 months working with clients to assist them into work. And 85% of clients flow off the register during that period. So only 15% of clients make their way through the next stage and go into services that we might provide. I guess the issue for Job Centre Plus is the churning that happens in that first 12 months. There's a lot of clients that go off the register, but within 6 months are back in again, and I think that's a major problem. I think in terms of the prime contractor model, though, we're in 7 what they call CPAs or regions, if you like. We deliver from 75 sites ourselves, but we subcontract to 150 subcontractors who are delivering in more than 200 other sites around the United Kingdom. At any given time on our IT system, we might have 2,500 advisors using the system. So the work program is a 2-year program. Obviously, our objective is to not use the whole 2 years, but we do a lot of work with our subcontractors, as I say, to ensure that they have access to the IT system as well as to any best practice initiatives that we have developed or that other providers have developed. We do a lot of networking across those subcontractors to make sure that that best practice is shared. And I think one of the points to make about this is that is the DWP commissioning strategy paper that was done a few years ago talked about public employment services being very good at high volume, light touch services, and that I think is true. When it gets to people working with people with multiple barriers, it's a huge investment for public employment services to try to do that. And I think one of the other elements of prime contracting, and I was talking to the head of the PES in Catalonia just before Christmas, and she has 1,500 contractors, NGOs that she works with, and they're finding that incredibly expensive and really hard to evaluate in terms of performance. So they are very keen to move down a kind of prime contractor model as well. I wanted to just explain how the payment system works in the work program, just so that you can get a sense of what the challenges are with this. Basically, the program started some 18 months ago, and there was an attachment fee, and then there's what they call a dead weight period, which is the period that's I guess assessed as being a time when people may, through their own efforts, may have got their own employment. So the trigger point for payments of sustainable employment is at either the 13 or 26 week point, depending on what the client cohort is, and then we get paid on a monthly basis for up to 2 years, again depending on the client. So as you can see, it's pretty much back-ended payments here. It's all about performance. The attachment fee's stopped now, so we don't get an attachment fee. We've actually attached 267,000 people on this program, and so that's been quite an enormous task. And the sustained payments are beginning to come through, but as you can imagine, quite a lot of investment up front with sort of lump in your throat for a while trying to work out whether it's actually going to work or not. Just an example though of numbers, over the last few months of last year we averaged over 8,000 placements a month in the UK, in a market that is not, it's a bit flat. It's starting to improve a little bit. I mentioned before increasing accessibility and reach, and this I think is a key element of the future. I've already touched on the importance of IT and social media with that, and I think as Elsol mentioned this morning, there are countries like the Netherlands, Estonia, that have developed really sophisticated IT support. And I think as you mentioned, in the Netherlands, it's extremely light touch for the first 9 months. People just access the IT system essentially, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. So IT is developing at an exponential rate. In Saudi Arabia, for example, we have developed a career portal in Arabic where we are assisting students to get outplaced from universities. We've actually just started a contract with a university to actually set up an employability unit within the university to actually help graduates into work. Huge issue in Saudi, a lot of young people graduating and a lot of young people graduating with, as I said earlier, some unrealistic expectations about what the market might hold. We've also developed in our systems a job scraping tool which scrapes several vacancy databases, job matches people and messages people automatically to say, contact your advisor, there's a job for you. And I think the important part of that is it enables people to feel like they're part of an active labour market. And that's incredibly important. We're also we've introduced texting to remind people about appointments they've got, and the impact has been a 15% increase in turn-up rates to appointments, and that's quite an extraordinary statistic. As I said to the guys over there, my dentist does it to me all the time. I can't see why we can't do it as well, and it certainly makes a difference. We've also developed a labour market portal which goes down to site level and enables advisors to give their clients up-to-date information about labour market trends, skills and demands, which employers are employing, etc., etc. And I think that kind of information is absolutely critical to people. I've got a couple of slides interspersed here on programs that we're running. This one is in France. It's called the Suburbs of Hope program. It started off being called the Burning Cities program, and I think the marketing guys got onto that and thought that's probably not a great idea. It's targeted at 16 to 25-year-olds, young people in disadvantaged suburbs of France. We've set up in those suburbs. We outreach to young people. These are people that are completely non-engaged. They're not registered anywhere. They're not participating. A lot of them with a North African heritage and so on. The good part about that is we're getting up to 65% of those young people into either work or training. 50% into work or around that number, which is great. In Saudi Arabia, it's been quite a fascinating journey. As I said, we started there in 2011. The Saudi government, through the Human Resource Development Fund, have contracted us in a pilot program, essentially. This is our second year of that pilot. We're operating 7 sites. 4 of those sites are dedicated male sites, and 3 of those sites are dedicated female sites. And the female sites work only with female clients. And I've met with our staff in our Jeddah office, which is one of our female sites, and some of the challenges that they experience are quite extraordinary. And they're finding innovative ways to get people into work. It's a 3-pronged strategy in Saudi. They have introduced what they call the Hafiz program, which is an unemployment benefit system, which has never existed in Saudi. They have also introduced the Nitikat program, which is for employers. It's a quota system for employers, which requires employers to have a certain number of Saudi employees. And if they don't achieve the quota, there can be sanctions, some as difficult as the cancelling of expat visas for their employees, which has certainly livened a few of these organisations up a bit. The third prong, I guess, of this strategy is the Takat program, which is what we do, and that's place people in work. 63% placement rate. In our Jeddah office, 50% of those females have never worked. And many have many restrictions to work in where they can work and how they can get there and so on. So we're delighted with how that program's run. But the Saudis implemented that. Talked to us. We had the first discussion in May, and we'd opened our first site in the September. With an Arabic IT system. So if you can think about how difficult that was to develop, screens going backwards and forwards and so on, none of the boxes seem to fit. But Saudi's been quite an experiment, and there will, we think, be a national rollout of that program probably this year. I wanted to also mention employer engagement, because I think employers are left out of the equation a lot of time in this business, and they are an absolutely critical part of this equation. And I guess from our point of view, we spend a lot of time generating, I guess, a level of trust and partnership with employers and industry. Demand-led programs actually do work, and we spend a lot of time again. Preparing our people with the knowledge, with in-depth knowledge of the employer's requirements, preparing our people properly for work. Just quickly, a program in Germany for mature age people, 50 plus, which always makes me feel a bit nervous. Shouldn't be called seniors. And it's all about overcoming barriers. But the reason I mentioned this program, it's 5,300 people, and we actually employ GPs on site and psychologists to support people fluctuating health conditions and so on. And are getting 40% job placement rate from that program, which is great. I'll quickly mention data analytics. As I mentioned earlier, we've got quite a big database now in the UK of people on our books, so we're starting to get a lot of information about the characteristics of that affect people's employability and so on. And a lot of our programs are now being designed around the data and analytics we get. We're sharing that with government. We had the Minister come to our offices recently, took him through the data analytics, and he turned around to his people and said, why can't we get this information? So that annoyed them a little bit, but it is great information, and as I've said there, it's a myth-busting machine. Some of the analysis that you can get is data analytics around identifying industries with higher sustainability rates and so on. And if you look at that graph, we're getting a lot of people into warehousing jobs, but they just don't stick. We get less people into caring jobs, but they do. And some of this is probably known to a lot of you about the different types of industries, but it's certainly helping us fashion our strategies. Also, just a quick one on IT. Internet usage is a key driver to successful job search, and we found that clients have 1.6 times more likely to find employment if they're able to access the internet and use it. I wanted to make a couple of points about procurement. And this is, I guess, the biggest issue for us at the moment. As we talked about before, one of the trends that we're seeing is a real squeezing of pricing, real downward price pressure across every country, and understandably, because governments obviously have cut budgets substantially following the global financial crisis. But just some points about that. The best procurement is where we see purchasers that have a really clear view of what they're looking for and how they're going to measure it, and the simpler the better in terms of the contract. We also enjoy the purchaser not being in the black box, and that's not always possible, as we know. But what we think it does is allow us a lot more flexibility to respond to the needs of clients and labour markets. There should be a proper balance of risk and reward, and sometimes that does get out of whack, but mainly it's around a mature market versus a developing market. I think in a developing market, the purchaser needs to take a little bit more of the risk, but in a mature market, it swings the other way, and the provider takes most of the risk. Obviously, longer contracts with higher numbers allow providers to invest more heavily and deliver a quality service, and I think that's really important. We've seen a trend towards, in a lot of the European countries particularly, towards shorter term contract, targeting really specific low numbers of clients, and it's very difficult for them to get a competitive market going with that kind of procurement. And the real cruncher for me is the cost per outcome versus unit price. And what we're seeing is unit price being the determinant in many of these contracts. And you might be rated at 100% of quality, but then it gets decided on price. And I've seen markets fail time and time again where they've gone for the cheapest option, and that's what they got. And it's just not very productive. What I hate about it is what it does to job seekers, what it does to employers, what it does to the image of the private sector, where some of these markets end up set up to fail because of the way the price has been calculated. I think we're better off with a cost per outcome, which means the taxpayer, a value for the taxpayer, and value for everybody concerned. So in conclusion, cooperation, as I mentioned before, works best. Delivering personalised, tailored services is where this is all going in the future. In an era of fiscal constraint, everybody needs to focus on sustainable outcomes. That really needs to be the core measure. And let's listen to our clients when we're developing developing new services. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Greg. As I've probably said when I introduced Greg, I think you're very generous in sharing with us. It's not, unfortunately, we've had some discussions today, which is not always a hallmark in a competitive sector, but it's certainly something which has always been a strong characteristic of you as an individual and NGS as an organisation. I think it was certainly very interesting, listening to the development of the organisation and then looking at basically the great work that you're doing and how many people's lives you're positively affecting through that great work. The trends, I think, were really, really interesting. I mean, again, that intersection between health and skills and the advent of social media and technology. I mean, there's sort of so much, I think, that is happening so quickly that these services have got to be responsive and flexible, and that goes to the design, to the procurement arrangements. I mean, there's so much in the mix that at the end of the day, we've got to basically be enabled to respond quickly to those trends. But one of the things I thought was really helpful too was to talk about the critical success factors as you see them. And again, I think that was very generous because what you're doing is actually sharing quite a bit of your IP in that process. Certainly I think there are a lot of takeaways for our audience from that. And I think probably for me, talking about best practice across borders, but you summed it up on one of your slides where you talked about global market solutions tailored to national needs do work. And I think that probably says it all. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Sally.
Do you want to, maybe you can take a seat over there? Yeah, take a seat over there and then we'll get you back up in a minute. Yeah. All right, so now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Considine, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. And Mark is known to all of us in this room. He's well known, of course, to many of us over quite a number of years in the industry as such, but in the broader community, particularly as it relates to a whole range of areas of public policy and debate. Mark's a Fellow of the Institute of Public Administration and the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and he's been associated with governments and the community sector in the implementation of a number of projects and organisational reviews. Some of those have included areas which have been directly related to employment and related services, including the OECD LEAD program review of local partnerships, the Premier's Working Party of Strategic Partnerships with the Community Sector. He did a communication and marketing review for the Job Network. Mark and I have sat on a number of different expert advisory panels around performance management framework, and Mark had the lucky honour of chairing the Quality Working Group, which is, so it's been quite a journey. Mark's research areas, however, are set broader than that. They include governance studies, comparative social policy, employment services, obviously, public sector reform, local development and organisational sociology, and he's currently involved in comparative studies both on the reform of employment services, as we've been brought up to date today, but also looking at projects look at the emergence of networks as an alternative to markets and hierarchies in the organisation of government and new governance systems. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks very much, Sally. We should have done something to try and prune that roll call of things. It reminded me of the story of Anthony Eden introducing Winston Churchill at some august event and went on at similar length about his great achievements, and Churchill got to the podium and said, well, after that introduction, I'm interested to see what I have to say. Yes, just to acknowledge Greg's willingness to give up time and be here and produce an insight into really an Australian success story, but also in a way a kind of case study, I think, of or a keyhole look at what's happening in this sector. And I thought just in the few minutes to respond that I'd take the opportunity on the basis of not much evidence, but some guesswork to try and think out loud about what might happen on the basis of what we've learned in this rather dynamic sector. What we might be in for. What have we learned already that might be able to support some generalisations about this sector? And I said this morning that I think it's probably been the experimental laboratory in some ways for public service reform more broadly. Certainly more going on here than in health, where all the big reforms, diagnostic-related groups and other health funding initiatives which were settled 10 or 15 years ago, and probably more dynamic than the other big spending sectors of government. So what might be happening, and what does the story, in a way that Greg has told about the evolution of his organisation, and in a way of Greg himself from CES, Employment National, through a public service vantage point into this very entrepreneurial sector. Well, I guess the starting point for me is that these remain public services. We're talking not about exiting the public sector from the problems of employment and unemployment. As these sectors, as they have in Australia, become populated by privately owned or non-government organisations, we need to keep the light flashing to say they remain public services. They're funded by the taxpayer. Ministers are extremely interested and somewhat accountable for the results, and the parliaments and other groups pay very close attention. And I think one of the paradoxical effects, design effects, of the way this multiple agency, somewhat competitive model has evolved and will evolve is that it's going to get more political. That things that were buried in a way in the Public Employment Service or the Ministry of Employment or whatever are in a certain way more exposed and getting even more exposed. Not everything, and I'll say in a minute or two that I think there's some kind of transparency issues in these markets that we have to pay attention to. But by and large, I think the trend is towards more political engagement, more political accountability, but also potentially more political manipulation. Certainly ministers now feel that the contracting regime and the design of the tender and the time for changes of government is an opportunity for new and upcoming ministers of employment or shadow ministers to really, really make their mark. And the ability for them to do that, I would argue, is far greater than it was in the old public service model. You could tell a new minister had arrived in the old PES because if his or her fascination was young unemployed people or the rural aged, there'd be a new program for them. And it might last a year or 2 years, and then the next minister would, thanks very much, roll that one back. Now a new minister, particularly in a new government, will, I think, lead to root and branch changes in the way the tender is operated, in the way the incentives operate, and the way the distribution of multi-million dollar contracts will impact into the sector. I think that means that international competition is also going to make local competitions in places like Australia tougher for local competitors. I think we've seen in the UK a sort of one version of the future, which is much bigger companies supported by non-employment funding agencies in order to help them be bigger. And I think that's going to present itself to governments as having a certain kind of attraction. Wouldn't we deal better with 5, particularly if they're million or billionaire companies who might have other advantages to us? Wouldn't we deal more easily with a smaller number at the top than many, as it were, blowfly organisations that we have to swat at on a regular basis? Sorry, Sally, I'm not looking at the NISA network when I think of that, but I'm thinking, you know, if you were the minister, you might think that way, and particularly if you were the senior public service, in charge of the procurement, you might think that way. So I think there is, spare of other considerations, probably a natural tendency for governments to now look at ways to engineer towards bigger contracts involving a smaller number of bigger firms. And you'd have to create a default against that to say, why wouldn't you? You'd have to ask yourself from a design and public policy point of view, what's wrong with that model? Because it looks on the face of it to have lower transaction costs. It looks on the face of it to be able to solve the problems of investment in site, in IT, and in the latest solutions. It looks on the face of it to enable a degree of professionalisation at the tendering and procurement process that local organisations sometimes struggle with. And from a political point of view, those organisations have a tremendous ability to put pressure on government and on ministers. And ministers, as we all know, are nothing if not sensitive to pressure. So the big organisations, and the bigger they get, the more able they will be to pressure governments to give them contracts of this sort. That is in the nature of the procurement game, not just in this sector, but everywhere. So that's the default position I think we're looking at. And we need to ask ourselves, why wouldn't a government do that? Well, let me say a few words about why at least they ought to be cautioned against too rapid an embrace in all of that. And I think Greg's given us some really good indicators of that new markets are a very different problem from a public policy point of view, quasi-markets, let's call them, than mature ones. And I think there's been some serious mistakes made by governments of both political persuasions around the OECD in so-called new markets. Extortionate profits have been made in some cases. A lot of public sector money has gone out into companies, for-profit and non-profit, with not much return on effort. And there's been some fraud involved in that as well, but most of the extortionate loss of public revenue hasn't been fraud related. It's just been poor design and poor understanding of the incentive systems. And while there's been plenty of learning about that and plenty of improvement since, you do have a sense in which there is an early market development phase when things can go very radically wrong for government and for public policy, very radically wrong. So there's more precarious choices for the willing reformer in this kind of environment than in the old staid and somewhat slow-moving PES world. I think that means in the future that we are, despite our general commitment, and in some cases very passionate commitment to collaboration, looking at a persistence of low-trust systems. I think we all believe that is pernicious and the last thing that we want, and it is nonetheless the thing that we keep creating. It's not a design feature, it's a design consequence, and we're all struggling, both from a kind of observer's point of view, but also sometimes advising governments and organisations. And I know from the organisation's point of view, and Greg's given a really good account of this tonight, that the desire, the need, and the personal and passionate commitment of the participants is for collaboration. And yet we keep producing in various ways a low trust environment. And I think that's not an inevitable outcome of a procurement environment, but it is the kind of default position. Unless you actively design against that, and that the incentive system is vigilant against that, that's what you'll get. If you design the other way for a high trust environment, and the most desirable form of a high trust environment would be to say, we're not going to tell you what to do, we're just going to give you the money when you get the result. Right? 3 years from now, you'll get, if it's a very at-risk job seeker, we'll give you, let's say, $15,000. And let's not kid around and think that very highly disadvantaged people are going to get into secure employment on the whole for small amounts of money. That's one of the the traps that many ministers and departments have made. The problem there is you really want to believe and be able to trust that they'll still be there in 3 years and that they won't have taken, most of the profit with them as they left. So getting high trust is strongly associated, we can see, with getting those performance-related results. But governments, for all the reasons we understand, and other public advocates, for all the reasons we understand, have a natural tendency to say, we want to see what you're doing with taxpayers' money. We want to know what happened this week and next week and the week after. If the unemployed were spending their own money, it would be a different story. If you were going and if you were the purchaser, we would be talking about a different kind of model, but we're not, and we really need to keep reminding ourselves. I think the other couple of points I'd make before ending, and it really does relate to the Ingeus approach, is that there is a natural and persistent conflict in our sector between the ability to generate a good and sustained profit off a kind of high volume and rather simple interaction system. We've seen in many of the research projects that our colleagues are doing here and in Europe and elsewhere, the emergence of what I'd call the sort of Riverside model. Now, Riverside was the evaluation, as I think I mentioned earlier this morning, seems a long time ago now, that set the bar in the North American case for what works. And in particular, it set the bar for an anti-campaign against what I'd call high investment policy. So the two icon cases were the Riverside Initiative and the Los Angeles County Initiative. And in Riverside, the manager of the employment service worked on a kind of counselling and coaching model. Nobody got sent to learn English. Nobody got sent to learn how to drive a forklift. Nobody got sent to training. They were sent to the first available entry-level job that could be found. And if they fell out of that job, it didn't matter. They'd be sent to the next one. So it was keep them moving, turn them over, etc. Down in Los Angeles County, where there are a lot of very long-term unemployed people, many of whom were low skill, a high percentage was sent for training to improve their English, their numerical skills, their computer skills, to get them up to a level where they would have a chance at sustainable employment. Well, guess what? In the evaluation, which one of those counties came out as having the higher rate of job success? It was Riverside. And from then on, really, we've had this model in both public and private sector that shows us that you can get tremendous results from that approach. But it has also left, I think, either a blind spot or a bit of a stigma around the high investment end of the approach. Governments certainly are very sceptical of it. I was involved a few years ago with a project to restructure the Victorian government's community jobs program, which had been a sort of remnant of days gone by. And the minister was genuinely interested in a much more sort of high-value approach to people who had multiple disadvantages. So we designed a program that would treat fewer people who were right out on the end of where the job network was then operating, and many of whom were in one way or another parked or disengaged, and would provide housing, training, and a range of services that state governments can create, and that we would target ex-prisoners, Indigenous, 5 years plus unemployed, and mental health, and many with 2 or 3 of those as well. So pretty hard to reach. The unit cost that was initially proposed, based on some figures that we had done, was about 20 grand. That you could get a sustainable placement for a high number of those kinds of people by spending 20 grand on the ancillary services and putting them into jobs. You won't be surprised, but other people who don't work in this sector would be, to find that when that got to the Cabinet subcommittee, they loved everything about the program except the 20 grand. And when it came back, it had turned into 7 grand. Well, you can guess what the result was on the outcome of the program. So we have a real problem, I think, in encapsulating for governments and then for a service delivery model, exactly how we do the kind of investment in that Greg touched on. And I think it is true that one of the advantages of bigger companies and bigger organisations is that they can manage the risk of that in a way that smaller contractors can't. If we motivate them to do it, if we hold the objective out, they've got a bigger budget and they've got a longer time period in which to balance that. If you're a small organisation, you've only got 100 clients and 10 of them are in that very hard to reach area, your willingness to spend significant amounts of money, your ability to spend significant amounts of money on even a few of them on the investment side becomes a very risky proposition. And you need a volume of clients at that level to be able to manage that. So I think we are beset with paradoxes. There are things about the larger provider, bigger contracts, more international market that promises hope. And I think from the public policy perspective, there are also things about that that create a degree, certainly in my mind, of risk. I'm not sure the average minister is up to the task of figuring some of this stuff out, and the bigger it gets, I think the higher the risks are. So as always, we're stuck with having to figure out as citizens, and certainly as observers, if not participants, how do you strike a balance? I've had a great day today. I love coming to these meetings. So many papers that are inspiring, and so much work that goes on in this sector that really does make you feel great about what public services can achieve. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
All right, questions from the floor.
Katrina Curry from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. I just wanted to ask Greg, you talked a bit about data analytics. Can you say more about the data sources for that? Do you get that primarily from your assessment of clients, or does it come from other agencies as well?
I missed the first part.
Your data analytics.
Oh, right, sorry.
So do you get your data analytics from the assessments you do of clients? Is it your data, or is it data you gather from multiple sources? So do you get access to agency data? Do you get access to government data?
Well, in terms of the actual data analytics that we use, it's our data. As I say, we provide that up to government and also across to our subcontractors. But we also access, when we're talking about the labour market portal, we access websites and various other things to educate our people on the broader environment. But the data analytics that I was talking about are actually, it's our data.
I'll be cheeky and have a second question.
Yeah.
Just quickly, the example you gave of clients and client design, you talked about a lone parent program. What exactly did you do that actually engaged clients in the design of that program? We had a forum with clients. This was in Nuremberg. At a forum with clients to say, what are the actual barriers that you're facing? What are the sorts of things that we can do? And I guess one of the biggest ones was childcare. So we set up a childcare creche within the office, staffed by professional child carers to try and mitigate that problem. There were a whole range of other issues or strategies that they wanted to put in place, which we did, and it turned out to be quite successful.
Thanks. Siobhan?
Hi, Siobhan O'Sullivan. I'm interested in how policy decisions are translated into activity at the front line, and your company is in the market around the world, a range of different countries. How much impact does policy decision have on how your frontline staff operate? Is it your view that providing employment services is pretty similar around the world, or does the policy setting really make it a very different experience?
I think one of the great frustrations that I've seen as an ex-public servant as well is where great policy doesn't actually evolve into great practice. And the whole policy into practice issue is something that we see all the time. It must drive ministers mad when they see a great idea go awry for whatever reason.
Look, we work within the policy framework in each country, and we try to influence it as much as we can, particularly with developing markets. And we spend a lot of time sitting down talking about what works and what doesn't work through all of that. But in the end, obviously, our job is to implement the policy of that government, put that policy into practice, and we take that very seriously.
Good. Can I just ask a supplementary question to that? And that is your practice models, though. So there's the policy, but then there's the frontline service delivery. So with your practice models, for example, taking the example of single mums returning to work, would you see a lot of similarities in your actual frontline practice from country to country?
Oh, absolutely. I think the reality is, as I mentioned before, with every difference in labour market, there's a similarity, obviously, and people are the same everywhere. I mean, one of the things that worried us going into the Korean market was whether case management would actually work in that culture, and it does. People are just people.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I think we've done pretty well, actually, haven't we? Look, again, to conclude, our sincere thanks to both of you. Greg, thank you very much for your generosity of time, and also, again, your generosity just in generally sharing the work of the organisation, and for taking the time out of your busy international travel schedule to come to Melbourne to see us. And Mark, it's always brilliant to actually hear how you synthesise everything and sum it up so neatly and succinctly. And when I sit there, I think, that's right. Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. So thanks very much to both of you. All right.